The United Nations is among those urging Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni to veto an anti-LGBTIQ plus bill that has harsh penalties for homosexual couples. Senior Director of Law Policy and Research at Outright International, Neela Ghoshal, joins me now via our video link from Washington, D.C. to discuss these developments. Neela, very good afternoon. Appreciate your time on Africa Today. Obviously, major concerns for you. Talk to us about where your biggest areas of concern are.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. First of all, Outright International, where I work, completely agrees with the High Commissioner for Human Rights that this is quite possibly the worst anti-LGBTQ bill anywhere in the world, with the most significant disturbing provision being the death penalty for certain consensual same-sex acts. And so one of those acts is so-called serial offenders of consensual homosexual conduct, which means that if you are gay or lesbian and you have a partner and you are arrested multiple times for having consensual sex with your partner, you are subject to the death penalty. This is just beyond belief. There are a few other countries that have on their books laws that put in place the death penalty for same-sex acts. In most cases, those are countries that have very severe forms of Sharia law. So something like this coming into play now in 2023 in Uganda is absolutely shocking. There are a number of other provisions that are deeply concerning. One of them is a provision that requires people to report anyone that they suspect of same-sex relations. So this means that mothers are forced to report their children, teachers are forced to report their students, doctors are forced to report their patients, which means that nobody who is LGBTQ is going to be able to safely out themselves to a medical professional, to a therapist, to a counselor, to a friend, to a family member. The bill also prohibits the so-called promotion of homosexuality, and this means any form of advocacy of the human rights of LGBTQ people. So it effectively attempts to silence any discourse arguing that LGBTQ people have human rights.
Well, there is something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Politics Rights. How does this bill relate to those laws?
This bill is in absolute violation up and down of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Universal Declaration, and also the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So it violates the right to non-discrimination under international human rights law. We are all born free and equal, and we are equal before the law. And there's very clear guidelines from UN treaty bodies that this applies to things like sexual orientation and gender identity. We cannot be discriminated against. This law also violates the right to privacy, it violates the right to dignity, and it also violates things like the right to health care, the right to the highest attainable standard of health, the right to work, the right to housing, because landlords are also forced under this bill to evict LGBTQ tenants. If their premises is being used for homosexuality, those landlords can be held accountable under the law. Right to freedom of expression, right to freedom of association. LGBTQ organizations cannot form under this law. They can't express themselves, and journalists can't express themselves in support of LGBTQ rights. So, I mean, it's essentially like the government of Uganda has taken the international human rights agreements that it is party to and shredded them.
So let's talk about Sharia law, which you raised a few minutes ago. How does Sharia law work in the context of there are certain things that are not permitted in certain countries, for instance, that practice Sharia law, that would be permissible in other countries that don't practice it?
Well, countries that have very strict interpretations of Sharia law will have provisions in their laws that prohibit typically same-sex conduct between men, that often put in place sentences of flogging or the death penalty. Now, these are based on a particular interpretation of the Quran. And one thing that is notable, although it certainly doesn't excuse the 7 or so countries that have these laws on their books, one thing that is notable is that countries that do have these provisions under Sharia law hardly ever actually implement them. And one reason for that, I mean, we can get into, kind of the details of Islamic law, but under Islamic law, typically, traditionally, one must have 4 witnesses in order to be able to convict someone. So these laws exist in theory in about 6 or 7 predominantly Muslim countries, but are rarely, the death penalty is rarely carried out in practice.
But is it not, sorry, is it not also a case that because Sharia law is so prohibitive by its nature that nobody wants to find out if the penalties will be implemented? I mean, if we take a basic thing like stealing in any of the countries that practice Sharia law, such as the Emirates, some of the Emirates, right? You will go into a department store, you will leave your bag on the floor, and 6 hours later you'll find it in the very same place because of the strict adherence to Sharia law.
Yeah, the same does not apply for consensual same-sex conduct, and that is the reality of human nature. If people are attracted to individuals of the same sex, they are going to be forming relationships with individuals of the same sex. And so basically, what this kind of prohibition of same-sex conduct does is create a class of citizens who are illegal persons. It does not stop the conduct. It will never stop the conduct because this is part of human nature. What it does is criminalize people for who they are and who they love and who they're attracted to. And so these laws are extremely problematic in the countries that have these laws in place under Sharia law. But, really I want to focus on Uganda right now because we have a chance in Uganda to stop this law from going forward, right? It's been passed by parliament, and it now is up to President Museveni to decide whether he rejects or assents to the bill. And I sincerely hope that the fact that it is so out of step with international human rights best practices and common sense by instituting the death penalty for consensual same-sex relations will be one of the things that will make President Museveni think twice and think perhaps that Uganda does not want to be known as the country in sub-Saharan Africa that has decided that it's okay to execute people for who they have consensual sex with.
Now, obviously, you work for a law firm, and you will understand that the constitution of a country, in many regards, may override international law, because it is what the people, the citizens of a country, believe in and have voted for. So in this particular instance, is this not about what the people of Uganda themselves want?
Countries' constitutions do not override international law. In fact, when a country becomes party to an international treaty, it is bound to that international treaty, and it's incumbent upon that country to ensure that its constitution and that its laws are in line with that international treaty. And so there are a few countries in the world that are not party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Uganda is not one of them. Uganda is party to these treaties, and it is absolutely bound by their provisions. And that means that people, citizens of a country, are not able to decide that they want to violate the human rights massively of any group of citizens. And we just have to look back at Nazi Germany for, one of the most horrific historical examples of what happens when a country determines that it is its government's decision that the human rights of a group of citizens are going to be violated en masse, right? So the logic that that the citizens of Uganda can do anything they want, including put people to death for their identity, is absolutely not true under international law. There are clear standards, countries are bound to them, and they must adhere to them. And that applies not only to the death penalty, which is the most severe element of this bill, but also to things like freedom of association and freedom of expression. The international system works because countries have signed on to these principles, and it is not their choice to arbitrarily deprive one minority of those rights, because you can imagine how horrific the consequences.
Well, I don't think it's arbitrary, because if we look at the bulk of African countries, they are homosexual. In fact, many of the Ugandans that were interviewed, unfortunately, the clip was played a little bit earlier, but we can't play it now. But supporters of the bill, right, argue that homosexuality is a Western import and that is incompatible with Ugandan culture and values. So this is what the majority of Ugandans themselves are saying.
You don't subject the rights and the safety and the lives of a minority to the whims and the will of the majority. That's a key principle under international law. It's what keeps us all safe. If today it's LGBTQ people whose lives and whose rights are going to be written away, tomorrow it could be people of an ethnic minority, a religious minority, it could be journalists, it could be opposition politicians, and we do not agree, and by we I mean humanity, we do not agree, and that's what the international human rights system is about, that the whim of a government or the whim of a people can completely ride roughshod over the rights of a small group.
So why is it a whim? Because this has been what has been acceptable for time immemorial, right, in these African states. Now, over the last few years, there's been a new school of thought, if you will, however you decide to term it, where homosexuality is becoming more and more acceptable, and with it, the rights of those who choose to identify as homosexual. But prior to the pronouncement of many of these rights, it already went against the culture and beliefs of the people of Africa. Now, while we're there, it might be proper to then talk about...
I'd like to respond to that, because Uganda, like every other African country, has a long documented history of same-sex conduct. And we know well the story of the Kabaka in Uganda in the pre-colonial period, who was known to engage in same-sex relationships. Ugandans also know these stories. It's not a secret, and it's a myth that same-sex conduct is a Western import, pure and simple. So that's factual, and that's not something that is up for dispute. It's also a fact that the criminalization of same-sex conduct is a colonial import. This is something that came to Uganda in the form of the British colonizers copying and pasting the Indian Penal Code, which they had put in place in 1877 in one of their other colonies, into Uganda. That's where the criminalization of same-sex conduct came from. It did not come from Ugandans. So that is not to deny that there's certainly a number of Ugandan people today who have absorbed these colonial ideas that come from the period of Queen Victoria, according to which same-sex conduct is unacceptable. But there was not, pre-colonial notions that people should be put in jail, killed, or denied freedom of expression because of their sexual desires.
Neela, before we carry on, there's a clip I'd like you to watch for a minute, and then we'll carry on with the conversation in a moment.
We are created by God. God created man and woman, and we cannot accept one sex to go on the same sex. So same sex. And actually what I'm saying is for the majority of Ugandans, I would say that.
The bill which had been passed for life, for those people who are interested in such a thing, though I'm a parent, children of ours are the ones doing such a thing. If the parliament had decided, it is okay, because I can't see such a child of mine doing such a thing.
So we have a couple of Ugandans that have voiced out in support of the bill, or they're probably anti-homosexuality. May not represent the entire population, but certainly the one gentleman feels that he's speaking on behalf of many Ugandans. So food for thought for you, but while we're at it, let's talk about the ramifications for the Ugandan government from the international community.
If I can just say something in response to those two clips. The first is that everybody is entitled to their religious beliefs, but religious beliefs do not mean that on a national level, in our national laws, anywhere, that we implement the precepts of a Christian or Muslim or Jewish or Hindu faith, and that we force those on the entire population, right? That's freedom of religion, which is another freedom that's recognized under international human rights law and also is recognized by Uganda. I also think it's quite interesting to hear the clip of someone saying that she couldn't imagine that her child would be homosexual because, of course, none of us have control over how our children turn out. And what is appalling is the idea that that mother, if her child turns out to be homosexual, is going to have to report him or her. and is going to have to watch her child face the risk of being executed by the state. And I think that if I'm a parent, I think that if any parent really steps back and thinks about what could happen to their child under this law, they might rethink having these.
Well, maybe they don't have to report them. I mean, you did give the illustration of Sharia law in the Emirates, where they're obliged to have 4 people report it. And it seldom happens that 4 people make that report. But very quickly, Neela, before we let you go, we've run short of time. Let's talk about the ramifications on the Ugandan government by the international community if President Museveni does go ahead and sign this bill into law.
Yeah, one set of consequences that will be quite clear is that it will be almost impossible for development actors, and that means those who are financing a large part of Uganda's economy, to keep functioning within Uganda. Because it is very difficult to do things like fund the health sector or the education sector when you know that doctors and teachers are going to be required to report LGBTQ people. And so I think that Uganda is probably going to face some pretty severe development consequences if it passes this law. I know that the World Bank is extremely concerned about the passage of this law, and that previously when Uganda passed a version of this law in 2013, that there were severe ramifications from the World Bank, from development partners, and from the whole of the international community. And so I think Uganda can expect to find itself quite isolated if it puts a bill of this nature in place.
Neela, I would have liked to have talked some more. It's been very entertaining. Appreciate your time this evening on Africa Today. And that was Neela Ghoshal, Senior Director of Law Policy and Research at Outright International.